Good morning, family. Good to see everyone. I wanted to share from Joshua 23 today. While you're turning there, I can give you a little bit of the context is that we've been in our Young Men's Bible Study on Thursday nights, we've been reading in the book of Hebrews. And in the book of Hebrews, in chapters 3 and 4, there's mention of the Sabbath rest of God. And it talks about in Hebrews 4:1 that there remains therefore a Sabbath rest for the people of God. And it tells us to fear that if any of us seem to have come short of it. I think I mentioned this last week. And it mentions how Joshua, it says, I think it's later on in Hebrews 4, it says, if Joshua had led them into the Sabbath rest, it wouldn't say that there remains a Sabbath rest. So there's some way in which Joshua did not lead Israelites into the Sabbath rest of God. And so I was looking in Joshua so you can understand this more. And there's an interesting, we're going to be in Joshua 23. That's where I ask you to turn. But if you want to go one left to the end of Joshua 21, this is, Joshua came after Moses, and Moses he led the people out of Egypt, obviously, and then through the 40 years of the wilderness, and then he passed the mantle to Joshua, and Joshua leads the people into the promised land, and there's a lot of battles, there's a lot of overcoming the enemies there, and then in verse 43 of Joshua 21 it says, so the Lord gave Israel all the land which he had sworn to give their fathers, and they possessed it and lived in it, and the Lord gave them rest on every side, according to all that he had sworn to their fathers, and not one of their enemies stood before them. The Lord gave all their enemies into their hand. Not one of the good promises which the Lord made to the house of Israel failed. All came to pass. And it's amazing. I mean, it's an amazing promise that literally everything God had promised up until this point had been fulfilled. And there's a verse in Joshua 23 that it says, one of your men, in verse 10, it says, one of your men puts to flight 1,000, for the Lord your God is he who fights for you. So we see that they're coming into the Sabbath rest of God, into the promised land of full possession where none of their enemies were standing against them. It was absolutely a sovereign, supernatural work of God, that God divinely empowered the Israelites to have this conquering. So he did the impossible on their behalf. And I was thinking about it, it's amazing that everything that he had basically led up to, all the promises seemingly had been fulfilled at that point. It just made me think, why doesn't the Bible end there? I mean, God, he takes his people out of Egypt, he leads them through the wilderness, and he finally gives them, literally it says, everything that he had promised. None of the promises that the Lord made to the house of Israel failed. All came to pass. So if God's rest had been realized, why doesn't the Bible end there? And as I was thinking about that this week, what came to my heart was that the promised land, God's rest is not irrevocably entered. God's rest, once we enter it, once we enter into the promise of God, the story's not over there. It's something which, once we enter it, we must maintain possession of it. And the reason that the Bible doesn't end with Joshua 23 is that God's people were not diligent to maintain the rest which he had given them. Despite the fact that God delivered them and fulfilled every promise which he'd spoken to them, the Bible continues because they failed to maintain it. And it made me think for myself, we know that all these things are written for our instruction, as it says many times in the New Testament. It made me think that for me too, even once I enter into his rest, in some measure, as we all have, I think, even as we enter into his rest, we must be diligent to maintain his rest. So that's what I wanted to talk about briefly today. In Joshua 23, it says, we can look at verse 1, it says, now it came about after many days when the Lord had given rest to Israel from all their enemies on every side. Joshua was old and advanced in years, that he called them, the elders and the heads and the judges together. If you look at verse 5, think about it. They have completely entered the rest which God had promised. And what does Joshua say to the elders? Verse 5, the Lord your God will thrust them out from before you and drive them out from before you. Who? They've already defeated all their enemies. And what I see here, Joshua is talking to the heads of the people about God's going to continue to defeat people. But I thought we had rest on every side. I thought our enemies were defeated. And what I see here is that there's a statement of there's both a present rest being experienced, and yet we also have promises of future victory as well. And It's what I see here is that this means that God gave them rest from all their known enemies. All the enemies they knew that were in the promised land, God gave them rest from. And they could enjoy that, and yet there remained unknown enemies who would only be encountered after the known enemies had been defeated. And I think a lot of us we're striving to, by the power of God, as one against, putting flight to 1,000, so to speak, we're seeking to overcome the enemies that we see. And the question is, once we do, by God's grace, I believe we will, once we do, what happens? And for me, what I see here is that rest needs to be maintained. It's not that all the enemies are defeated. It's that all the enemies I know of are defeated. And then more will surely be revealed as the ones which I encounter and overcome by God's help are defeated. And we are called to victory over all of our known enemies. And we can be sure that there are still more unknown enemies. So as long as we allow known enemies in our promised land, so to speak, to live, we don't truly experience God's promised rest. His promised rest is that we would have protection from all known enemies. And then also, if we allow known enemies to live in our promised land, we don't discover the unknown enemies that still threaten us, which we're oblivious to up until this point. So, having entered in verse 1, Joshua says, or it says that the Lord had given them rest from all their enemies on every side. So what is Joshua's command? Is it relax? Is it take it easy? In verse 6, he says, be very firm then to keep and to do all that is written in the book of Moses. We've received rest from every side. There's no enemy that's prevailing against us. And what's the command next? Diligently observe all that God's commanded. If I'm experiencing rest from my known enemies, then be diligent to observe all that's commanded. In verse 11, he says again, take diligent heed to yourselves to love the Lord your God. These are strong words. Be very firm. Take diligent heed. What's the consequence of failing to do that? It says in verse 12, if you ever go back and cling to the rest of these nations, which remain among you, and intermarry with them, so that you associate with them and they with you, what's the consequence? Verse 13, know with certainty that the Lord your God will not continue to drive these nations out from before you, but they will be a snare and a trap to you, and a whip on your sides, and thorns in your eyes, until you perish from this good land which the Lord has given to you. The Lord's given me a good land, and yet if I am not take diligent heed to love the Lord with all my heart, the consequence is he will stop driving out the nations before me. And so I see that my rest, which only God can provide, as I've said, is supernaturally delivered according to the power and providence of God, is only maintained as long as I myself am careful to obey. As I am careful to obey, God works on my behalf to maintain this rest, which is impossible for me to attain to otherwise. And so it's made me think I really have to be diligent in that which God has given me today, this very day. Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. That there can be no complaining for me. These are things that, as I thought about today, what does today mean? No complaining, no bitterness, no laziness, no selfishness. I need to entrust myself to him to take these things seriously that he's given me today. And he will, as long as I'm diligent to obey and take diligent heed to love the Lord with all my heart, he will see to it to supernaturally protect me from my enemies and give me rest on every side. He'll keep his promise as I am diligent to obey. Today is the day the Lord has made. Today is the day of salvation. Why is today the day of salvation? Because today there are new enemies God desires that I conquer. Unknown before this point. But today, if I am obeying him, there will be new enemies to conquer. And this is the day the Lord has made to be the day of salvation. Even today, God wants to make today the day of salvation. And it made me just praise God and thank him that I can humble myself under his mighty hand in all the circumstances that he allows into my life. I can joyfully accept exactly what God has placed in my path, trusting that he's enough, that he will provide. And it just made me think, even if I don't feel rested, there are times that I feel tired, I feel worn out. And I think it's easy to think rest is a feeling. And if we feel rested, then we must be enjoying the Sabbath rest of God. But it's important for me to remember it's not a feeling. It's a spiritual reality of sovereign protection from my enemies. Rest is not something I feel, it's something that I believe. And God promises it's his to give. As I seek to obey him, he promises to give me rest. In the Old Testament, I've seen even, there's a verse in Deuteronomy 12, I think it's easy to think about the promised land being a physical land. And we say, I think rightly, it's not in the New Covenant, but maybe it was in the Old Testament. But even there, I saw a verse in Deuteronomy 12 in verse 10. It says, when you cross the Jordan and live in the land which the Lord your God is giving you to inherit, and he gives you rest from all your enemies around you so that you will live in security, then it shall come about that in the place in which your Lord your God will choose for his name to dwell, there you will bring all that I command you. What I saw here is, even to Moses, the promised land wasn't so much some physical geography, so much as it was a spiritual reality that God would supernaturally protect from all the enemies in the land as long as they were diligent to obey him. And the rest promised was for protection from our enemies. This was the ultimate rest, not just a special land, but a special experience of what would happen in that land. And it's the same for us in the New Covenant. And just like in the Old Testament, it's easy to think about the Sabbath rest or the promised land, this physical thing. I think in the New Covenant, our danger is we think of rest as this feeling. And we get lulled into thinking that if I feel restful, then I must be enjoying God's rest. And that's not true. It is for us as well a spiritual reality, a supernatural protection from our enemies. And who are our enemies in the New Covenant? We've talked about this. They're our flesh, the world, Satan. And the rest that remains, as I mentioned in Hebrews 4:1, the rest that remains for the people of God is protection and security from all of these enemies. These are the enemies that I can enjoy as part of the Sabbath rest that remains for the people of God. And it's important for me to remember I cannot protect myself from these enemies. But God himself, will supernaturally protect me and promises to do so as long as I fulfill my part, which is be careful to obey all that God has commanded me. As long as I'm careful to obey it, God will provide. And I was thinking one new enemy. I mentioned that as we defeat the old enemies, new enemies emerge that we didn't know existed before. And one new enemy that's come onto my radar this past week or two is laziness. I'm sure it was there before, but it was unknown to me. Just as the new enemies in the Promised Land were there before, they lived there. The Israelites just didn't know about them. But I've seen it. I've never seen so apparently that. My own kind of laziness, as I did this last week. And I've seen through this story, through the example specifically of this first generation in Joshua, that I must guard myself against laziness because it's actually the beginning of Israel's decline right after Joshua died. So we read this amazing story of God's faithfulness through Moses and through Joshua to fulfill his promises. It's utterly incomprehensible that the people of God would inherit and inhabit the land. And you can't imagine them forsaking him, right? Surely the people would never forsake such a wonderful God who's delivered them in so many ways. It's almost so great that you wonder, why doesn't the Bible just end? And yet it says, if we look just a couple of pages to the right in Judges 2, immediately after Joshua dies, in verse 7 it says, the people served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who survived Joshua. And then verse 11, then the sons of Israel, the very next generation, did evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals, and they forsook the Lord, the God of their fathers. And I was just thinking, it's only a generation difference. Why did they degenerate so quickly? And what I saw as I was studying this is it's because those who entered God's rest, those who entered the promised land, took possession of it, made compromises. They were not diligent to obey what God said here. If you look, they weren't diligent to drive out the inhabitants of the land. In Judges 1, what we see again and again is it's summarized well in Judges 1 verse 28. It says, it came about that when Israel became strong, i.e. entered the promised land and entered into the rest God had promised, that they put the Canaanites to forced labor but did not drive them out completely. And that's not what God asked them to do. He asked them to utterly drive out all the inhabitants of the land. And this, I see, is where the forsaking began, with very small compromises, which once I enter God's rest, and he's given me these seemingly small commands, am I serious about it? Or do I neglect it? And it's interesting because it seems like I'm sure they thought they were keeping the spirit of the law, right? They demeaned the inhabitants of Canaan. They put them into forced labor. How demeaning, how terrible. They thought they kept the spirit of the law, but they did not obey the letter of the law. And if you see, if you look, we don't have time to look at it now, but if you read Judges 2, the beginning of Judges 2, what you see is that this small thing caused God to decide to withdraw his power, his protecting power from them. And that's what ends up leading to verse 11 of chapter 2, that they ended up in this terrible degeneration and downfall, is because those who entered his rest did not take his command seriously. And why did they not get rid of him? Why didn't they take the command to drive out all the inhabitants seriously? I think it's because of laziness. I think they were lazy. They saw that the inhabitants could be used to do all the untasteful jobs, all the things that they don't really want to do. They are inhabiting this new land. They can enjoy all this new land. But there's all these kind of dirty tasks that need to be done. You know what would be better? We can inhabit the promised land, and we can get these inhabitants of the land to do all the dirty work. It's a double win, right? I'm sure is what the Israelites thought. And they wanted to get rid of anything that might make life more difficult for them in the promised land. And they were lazy. And it just made me think no extra benefit is worth the cost of the presence of God. No extra relaxation, enjoyment in the promised land is worth the benefit if it costs me God withdrawing. What we see here is God withdrew himself from them, and they went into terrible worshiping other idols and forsaking God. And it starts with this kind of careless ease. Ezekiel talks about that the sin of Sodom began, Sodom is, obviously associated with sexual sins, but it began, it says in Ezekiel 16, this was the guilt of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had arrogance, abundant food, and careless ease, but she did not help the poor. I see that even these terrible sins like Judges 2:11, it starts with this careless ease, this laziness, this sense of we don't have to work as hard as God's asking us to work. Once we're in the promised land, surely it doesn't require work, and we get lazy. And I've come to see that laziness it's a new enemy which I have to take even more seriously than I have before. I need to defeat it by the power of the Holy Spirit as one who can put to flight 1,000 by the power of God. And I want to be diligent to obey all that God has spoken to me once I've entered his rest, so that I might maintain the wonderful Sabbath rest that he's given me. May God help me.